From New York, this is Democracy Now! Hundreds of protesters storm Hong Kong's Legislative Council in the latest round of protests that have rocked Hong Kong. We'll speak with leading pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong, recently released from prison in Hong Kong.
It's time for us to urge Carrie Lam to withdraw the extradition law proposal, and it's her responsibility to step down and to face how 2 million people already joined the fight, and urge her to bear the political responsibility.
Then, as Senator Kamala Harris rises in the presidential polls, we'll look at how she's being targeted with a string of racist conspiracy theories. And we'll look at her record as a prosecutor in San Francisco and Attorney General of California.
When I became a prosecutor and when I was elected district attorney and also Attorney General of California, I implemented some of the most significant reforms to date during those years that had been implemented.
We'll speak to University of San Francisco law professor Laura Bazelon. In a New York Times op-ed, she contends Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump signed the $4.6 billion border bill approved by Congress last week, a delegation led by the Congressional Hispanic Caucus visited 2 immigrant prisons Monday amidst growing outrage at reports of inhumane conditions due to Trump's border policies. Texas Congressmember Joaquin Castro described the conditions at an adult facility as being akin to a prison where women were held in cells without access to running water and proper medical care. Some had been held for over 50 days. Others reported they had no information on the whereabouts of their separated children. The congressional delegation also visited the Clint Border Patrol station that has come under fire after recent reports of overcrowding and inhumane conditions for the children being locked up there. Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted after yesterday's visits, "It's not just the kids, it's everyone. People drinking out of toilets, officers laughing in front of members of Congress. I brought it up to their superiors. They said officers are under stress and act out sometimes." Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "No accountability." Congress members held a press conference outside the children's prison in Clint amidst boos and racist jeers from protesters. This is Massachusetts Congressman Ayanna Pressley.
Keep yelling. This is very appropriate. Vile rhetoric for vile actions. Hateful rhetoric for hateful behavior. Racist words and venom for racist policies. Very apropos. This is bigger than a funding debate or about any speeches that we give here on the floor of the House of Representatives. This is about the preservation of our humanity. And this is about seeing every single person there as a member of your own family. I am tired of the health and the safety, the humanity, and the full freedoms of black and brown children being negotiated and compromised and moderated. We need a system that works, that is humane, and that is compassionate, and that keeps families together.
On Friday, a federal judge ordered Customs and Border Protection, that's CBP, to let independent health monitors into detention facilities in Texas holding migrant children to ensure conditions are safe and sanitary. Last week, lawyers asked U.S. District Judge Dolly G. to hold the Trump administration in contempt over conditions in the facilities and to mandate immediate improvements. In related news, NBC News is reporting a federal watchdog warned in May that border agents armed themselves and feared possible riots due to the conditions at an El Paso, Texas immigration detention facility. The Associated Press has released a video showing a 12-year-old girl speaking to a lawyer about her and her 6-year-old sister's experience at the Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, which has been called a child jail. The two young girls were taken to the jail after being separated from their aunt when they arrived in the U.S. in May. The Clint Border Patrol station recently came under intense scrutiny after reports of widespread neglect and inhumane living conditions, including lack of food, water, sanitation, and medical care. This is an excerpt of the little girl from the AP video.
They gave us little food. Some children did not bathe. They didn't bathe them. They treated us badly where we were. They were mean to us.
Where did you sleep? Did you sleep on beds?
They slept on just the floor.
Did they give you blankets or not?
They would only give us one blanket.
And was it enough to withstand the cold?
No, some children were sick. They said that they'd take them to hospitals, but they wouldn't take them.
The young girl also told the lawyer children would cry out for their parents and other separated family members. Customs and Border Protection has opened an investigation into social media posts by border agents belonging to a racist, xenophobic Facebook group. The investigation follows the publication of a new piece in ProPublica, uncovering the secret Facebook group in which current and former CBP employees post racist, homophobic, anti-immigrant, and misogynistic content about migrants, as well as some lawmakers and other high-profile people. One post contained a photoshopped image of Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being sexually assaulted by President Trump. In another thread, members of the group made fun of a video of a man trying to carry a child through a rapid river in a plastic bag. Someone commented, "At least it's already in a trash bag." Asked by a reporter yesterday to respond to her depiction in the Facebook post, Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez said it was indicative of the culture she observed inside the migrant prison she had just visited, and said she did not feel safe around the officers. Congressmember Joaquin Castro added that some CBP agents have, quote, become desensitized to the point of being dangerous to the migrants in their care. Posts were also uncovered that mocked the Salvadoran father and 23-month-old young daughter who drowned last month while attempting to cross the Rio Grande to get to the U.S. border. Migrant father Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his young daughter Valeria were buried yesterday in their hometown in El Salvador in a private ceremony. A photo of their drowned bodies in the Rio Grande River caused both widespread outrage at the humanitarian crisis at the U.S. southern border and raised questions about the ethics of exploiting such images in the press. Journalists were not permitted to attend the funeral. El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, said Sunday that their tragic deaths were caused by flawed immigration policies and unsustainable situations in all the countries implicated, the U.S., Mexico, and El Salvador. In more immigrant rights news, a coalition of human rights and other groups are holding Close the Camps demonstrations around the country today, calling on lawmakers to shut down immigrant jails, defund detention and deportation, and reunite separated families. Meanwhile, Mexico's newly formed National Guard officially began operations Sunday, deploying 70,000 National Guard across Mexico. The force was set up by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador to combat violence from organized crime, but critics have called out recent incidents showing members detaining Central American migrants at the border. In related news, Mexican immigration officials said they recently deported over 80 Haitian migrants amid mounting pressure from the U.S. to stem the flow of northbound migrants. In Hong Kong, riot police used tear gas to forcibly remove hundreds of protesters occupying a legislature building early Tuesday morning. The activists began their occupation Monday when they stormed Hong Kong's Legislative Council and smashed the glass to gain entry, tearing down portraits of officials and spray painting the walls. The action took place as hundreds of thousands flooded the streets Monday to mark the anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese control 22 years ago. It's the latest in massive civil unrest that started last month when millions took to the streets to protest a bill that would allow the extradition of Hong Kong residents and visitors to mainland China. The vice chair of Hong Kong's pro-democracy Labour Party, Fernando Cheung, said the protests would continue until the government completely withdraws the extradition bill.
I think this is going to go on for a real long time if the government does not withdraw the bill completely and does not express or have any actual plan to rebuild the communication between the people and its regime. Hong Kong is still in unrest. We are very much not satisfied with the government not allowing a complete withdrawal of the extradition bill, and also a real urge from all sides to establish an independent inquiry to the whole fiasco.
We'll have more on Hong Kong after headlines. Iran announced it surpassed the limit on uranium enrichment permitted under the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal and said it would continue to increase its stockpile. Trump responded to the news by saying Iran was playing with fire. The Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, said they would not bow to U.S. pressure but would engage in dialogue with any parties that demonstrate respect. Last week, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom said that Instex, an alternative financial mechanism that would circumvent U.S. sanctions, was operational. Iran said the system was a positive development, but that Europe was not buying Iranian oil and needed to do more to uphold its commitment to keeping the landmark 2015 agreement alive in the face of President Trump withdrawing last year and crippling sanctions. Japan has resumed commercial whaling after more than 30 years of adhering to a global ban on the practice. Japan, which has argued whaling is part of its culture, continued to hunt whales during the ban for what it claimed was scientific research, though critics say that was merely a veil as it continued selling whale meat for profit. Last December, Japan announced it was leaving the International Whaling Commission. Greenpeace Japan called that decision out of step with the international community, adding, quote, "Japan must urgently act to conserve marine ecosystems." Back in the United States, the Department of Agriculture is in turmoil as the agency prepares to move hundreds of jobs from the capital to Kansas City. Last month, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue announced the relocation of 2 key research agencies, prompting a dramatic silent protest by over a dozen employees who stood up and turned their backs to the stage Perdue was speaking from. Employees must now choose whether to move or lose their jobs. Politico is reporting a survey shows that 4 out of 5 employees may decide to quit rather than relocate. Numerous scientists, lawmakers, agricultural, environmental groups have called out the move by Perdue, which they warn will harm employees of the agency and farmers and is part of the Trump administration's agenda to suppress climate research. Last month, Politico reported the agency stopped promoting dozens of publicly funded scientific studies about the impacts of climate change. Democrats have thus far been unsuccessful in their attempts to stop the move through legislative and other measures. Many of those who are being forced to move are economists and scientists responsible for some of the cutting-edge climate change research in this country. And President Trump has requested a military spectacle, including tanks and fighter jets, for the upcoming 4th of July parade and his address to the nation. Officials have raised concerns about the ballooning cost of the event, as well as the potential for physical damage to the mall due to the massive military hardware. A planned military parade for last year, proposed by President Trump, was scuttled after it was revealed it would cost up to $92 million, including $50 million in Pentagon costs. On Monday, the D.C. Council expressed its opposition to having tanks drive down Washington, D.C. streets, tweeting, "We have said it before and we'll say it again. Tanks, but no tanks." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show with massive civil unrest in Hong Kong, where riot police used tear gas to forcibly remove hundreds of protesters occupying a legislature building early Tuesday morning. The activists began their occupation on Monday when they stormed Hong Kong's Legislative Council and smashed the glass doors to gain entry, tearing down portraits of officials and spray painting the walls. Some demonstrators held a sign reading, "There are no violent rioters, only a violent regime." The action took place as hundreds of thousands flooded the streets Monday to mark the anniversary of the city's return to Chinese control 22 years ago. It was just the latest mass demonstration since millions took to the street in a series of marches last month to protest a contested bill that would allow for extraditions of Hong Kong residents and visitors to mainland China. Activists say the law is an infringement on their legal rights and on the independence of Hong Kong.
Protesters are calling for Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam to step down over the legislation. She postponed the bill under public pressure, but has not yet fully withdrawn it. This is Carrie Lam speaking at a news conference earlier today.
We have not responded to every demand asked because of good reasons. Now, first of all, if the cause of the social tensions that we have seen is a bill to amend the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance, on the 15th of June, I have announced the suspension of the bill. And subsequently, we have explained and elaborated by suspending the bill at this point in time with no timetable and no plan to resume the debate of the bill in the Legislative Council.
That was Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Well, for more, we go to Hong Kong, where we're joined by pro-democracy lawmaker Claudia Mo. She's a member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Claudia Mo. Can you talk about what took place yesterday?
Now, the pictures you see are actually rather shocking. They were devastating and perfectly unexpected. But then behind all this, I hope the whole world will try to understand and sympathize with Hong Kong's young people, the anger and the resentment, the frustration that's been panting up all these years, the sort of environment they're growing up. And so they might have become probably unnecessarily militant, but they're trying to get their voices heard, not just in Hong Kong, but hopefully across the world.
Can you talk about where you were yesterday, Claudia Mo?
I was milling around, basically. Sometime in the afternoon, I tried to urge two apparent leaders of the more militant protesters to rethink about their plan to storm the legislative building. But the reply I got was that we knew you very concerned, but then don't worry about us. We are okay. We perfectly knew what we're doing. The sad thing is there seems to be a tiny bit of this martyr mentality among our young, that they would die. They don't mind dying for this democracy fight in Hong Kong. What's their voice? Basically, it's democracy now.
And
for
Claudia,
Hong Kong.
Claudia Mo, I'd like to ask you, in terms of the existing so-called democratic structure in Hong Kong, obviously under China's one country, two systems policy, how is the legislature chosen in Hong Kong, and what is the impact of the People's Republic of China government over Hong Kong?
Yes, exactly. That's a quick question to be answered. The young's particular anger at the legislature, it's mainly mainly stems from the fact that it's this very legislature that was going to pass that controversial China extradition bill. Why? Because they've got enough Beijing votes in there, and it's all because of our very twisted and convoluted kind of election system. They make sure that the pro-Beijing votes will occupy at least half of our seats. That's a total number of 70. They make sure that they will have enough votes to pass just anything, any policy, any bill, any funding application from the government. And Democrats are always outnumbered. We're outnumbered not because we're unpopular, but because we just don't get the seats. We have more votes, but fewer seats. That sums up the Hong Kong legislative election. And the young knew it. And from the last election back in 2016, right after that, because of some oath-taking ceremony political stunts on the part of a few, the Hong Kong government managed to twist and bend rules and laws without breaking them, of course, and successfully kick out altogether 6 of our elected democratic lawmakers. And the young grew up with that sort of news. They knew perfectly what's going on in Hong Kong. Their anger is justified. May not be their action, but their anger needs to be understood.
I wanted to ask you, though, about Hong Kong is relatively prosperous as an entity in the world. It's rated with the highest level of economic freedom for business in the world, very low taxes. It's got the 7th highest human development index of any country in the world. And its GDP, its per capita GDP, is almost as high as the United States at 56,000. So it has prospered economically under Chinese rule. But could you talk about the impact of the economic prosperity versus the lack of political democracy?
Now, you have to note that Hong Kong's Gini coefficient is also amongst the highest in the world. This wealth divide in this city, it's just incredible. It's preposterous, really. And it's very free to businesses, right? Business prosper, businessmen make money, but then the wealth divide is getting worse and worse. And I just heard this afternoon from an Uber driver that, of course, we need to count in billions in Hong Kong. We're all very money-minded in Hong Kong because political protests, where do they take us? The government simply don't pay attention to you. Beijing tells you to just restore order. So we try to earn as much money as we can so that we can leave Hong Kong, emigrate.
Are you calling for Carrie Lam to resign? And the specific bill that she put forward, if you can briefly explain it.
Carrie Lam has been saying that she would suspend the particular controversial bill. Now, a suspension is always temporary. It can come back anytime. Why couldn't she just use the word withdraw, scrap, right? I was told that it's a phase problem, a phase issue in Chinese politics, that she has done climb down. She has agreed to suspend it, and she's not going to make any further climb down. It's so pathetic, right? And I'm quite convinced that she wouldn't dare to bring back that issue. But the thing is, it boils down to trust among the people, which she has completely lost by today.
Can you explain what happened inside the Hong Kong legislature yesterday?
The militant, well, mostly young protesters stormed the legislative complex, and by the way, they were genuine students. They're not infiltrators or provocateurs and that sort of the things. And they were so angry. They did everything they could to will damage the chamber, obviously. But one peculiar thing is, but just before the storming, the police, who have been stationed inside to guard the building, suddenly sort of retreated. The police chief subsequently said they had to redeploy their teams, the police teams. It's all due to very flimsy reasons. So you couldn't help but thinking that it's just possible they were trying to lure the protesters into the compound, the building, and do the vandalism expected, and so that the whole world will see those shocking photos and pictures and footages, and the young will get the blame for vandalism in Hong Kong, and the cause they're trying to fight for will be forgotten.
And so far, it's been the Hong Kong police who have basically been dealing with the demonstrators. Do you have any fears that if the protest continues, of the possibility of actually military from China coming into Hong Kong or not?
Yes, that's a fundamental scare about the Hong Kong security situation. Last night, I heard the youngsters talking about them needing to stay on outside the legislative building because they need to outnumber the police force. As long as we have enough people, they can't possibly arrest us all, and we have to protect those who have already gone in. Now, I've heard similar lines from young protesters 30 years ago on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And they were saying just the same things. Well, there's so many of us, they just cannot grab all of us, that kind of mentality. And under Hong Kong's mini constitution, the government is allowed to declare Hong Kong to be under some emergency state, and the People's Liberation Army would be sent out to the streets of Hong Kong to retain social order, what have you. That was a very scary thought. But then, thank God, it didn't happen. And I hope it will never get to that sort of situation again.
Again, are you asking for Carrie Lam to resign?
Of course, of course. Her days are numbered, as far as I could see, and many of us in Hong Kong. I mean, Beijing has tried to distance itself from Carrie Lam, suggesting that she's the one who started all this controversy and saga in Hong Kong. And assuming that's the case, Carrie Lam has proved herself to be completely inefficient, and she's been unaccountable almost to Hong Kong people. You saw the footage of her speaking at some press conference in the middle of the night yesterday, and she was putting on this bureaucratic face and complete with her bureaucratic voice, telling Hong Kong people, yes, I will humbly listen to you again. Where's the humility? You never got it. And the thing is that she will be sticking around a bit still, because I understand, well, many of us here understand that there's no replacement that's acceptable to Beijing yet at the moment, and it would be also a loss of faith to Beijing if they would have to let her go now. It's too soon, right? It's like bowing to the people, bowing to public pressure. So I wouldn't be surprised if she would need to go after all, say this time next year.
Claudia Mo, we want to thank you for being with us. Democratic lawmaker in Hong Kong, attended the protests on Sunday. This is Democracy Now! We were speaking to her in Hong Kong. Stay with us.
Do you hear the people singing the song of angry men? It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of your heart echoes the beating of the drums, there is a life about to start when tomorrow comes. Will you join in a crusade? Who will be strong and stand with me? Beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see?
Then join in the fight that will give you the right to be free. Do you hear the people singing the song of angry men? It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of your heart echoes the beating of the drums, there is a life about to start when tomorrow comes.
Will you give all you can give so that a banner may...
Do you hear the people sing from the soundtrack of Les Miserables? Protesters in Hong Kong have adopted the Broadway show tune as their anthem. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
California Senator and presidential candidate Kamala Harris is riding a new wave of momentum following her debate performance last week when she challenged Joe Biden's past history of working with segregationist lawmakers and his opposition to busing to integrate schools in the 1970s. Well, Harris has jumped in several opinion polls. There's been also a right-wing backlash online. On Thursday, the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., retweeted a message from an alt-right personality that read, quote, "Kamala Harris is not an American black. She's half Indian and half Jamaican. I'm so sick of people robbing American blacks like myself of our history. It's disgusting. Harris's family were actually slave owners."
So the tweet said. Donald Trump Jr. reposted the tweet, adding, "Is this true? Wow." Trump Jr. then deleted the tweet later that night after coming under fire from several other 2020 presidential candidates, including Joe Biden, who tweeted, quote, "The same forces of hatred rooted in birtherism that questioned Barack Obama's American citizenship and even his racial identity are now being used against Senator Kamala Harris," unquote. 2020 Democratic presidential hopeful Julian Castro told CNN Donald Trump Jr. behaved like a coward.
This is the game that these folks play. They put something out there. You notice what he did. He tweeted it out, and then he deleted it. Like a coward, so he can say, oh, that was just a mistake. But he knows what he's doing. He's giving voice to these racist, utterances about Senator Harris. We need to dispel them immediately and condemn them and then not give them any more life because they're disgusting.
So that's presidential candidate Julian Castro. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Shireen Mitchell, founder of the group Stop Online Violence Against Women. Shireen Mitchell, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you respond to this tweet and delete of Donald Trump Jr. and talk about this in the tradition of the Trump family? Really, President Trump himself, just as a private New York developer, leading the birther movement against President Barack Obama, questioning where he was born.
Yes. This is not just a pattern of this family, the Trump family, but please remember, Trump is also the one that tried to get 5 brown and black boys executed in Central Park. So let's not forget that this is a history within this family of racism. The other parts of this is that we also need to remind ourselves, and also they participated in housing discrimination. There were all kinds of legal ramifications about them targeting black and brown communities. So this isn't new. So this is not a surprise to me and it should not be a surprise to anyone else. The ways in which they use our identity as a weapon to rally their base is very problematic and very consistent. So Kamala, being a woman of color, and running for office and running against Donald Trump going forward. This is not a surprise that they would start this early. But also be clear that this online harassment of Black and brown women has been going on as a part of the election process. And it's been going on since 2013 as we tracked many of these behaviors of pretending to be Black women, trying to defame or discredit Black women. And this example is exactly that. To say that Kamala is not an American Black when she was born in Oakland is ridiculous. But this harkens back to what was happening with Obama as well, that his father was Kenyan, so somehow that made him not Black enough, not born here, when he had to prove that he was. And that's the part of the birtherism that was being expanded upon when Donald Trump himself started promoting that campaign that Barack Obama had to explain his existence in this country. I would say there is no other group that is constantly asked to identify as American because we have the term African American, that somehow we're choosing African first. And that example is an example that happens in our community, but also it's very much used as a weapon against us.
And Shireen Mitchell, what do we know about the person who actually posted the tweet, this Ali Alexander?
So what I found out, or as some of us who are still digging a little bit deeper, this gentleman happens to be connected to some of the other right-wing groups and the alt-right groups, associations with Laurie Loomer, Jacob Warhol. So he is associated with this. So it wasn't a surprise that Donald Trump retweeted him because he's been a part of that community.
And finally, your response to, well, this went before the tweet and delete of Donald Trump Jr. In February, Senator Kamala Harris spoke to The Breakfast Club. This is radio host Charlamagne the God's questioning Harris about memes circulating online about her.
Yeah, another meme says, Kamala Harris is not African-American. Her parents were immigrants from India and Jamaica, and she was raised in Canada, not the United States. And it said, fact. That's what the meme said.
So I was born in Oakland.
Yeah.
and raised in the United States, except for the years that I was in high school in Montreal, Canada. And look, this is the same thing they did to Barack.
Yes.
This is not new to us. And so I think that we know what they're trying to do. They're trying to do what has been happening over the last 2 years, which is powerful voices trying to sow hate and division among us. Mm-hmm. And so we need to recognize when we're being played.
I'm glad you mentioned Barack, because a lot of Black people question if Barack was Black enough. I see them doing the same thing to you. So what do you say to the people questioning the legitimacy of your Blackness?
I think they don't understand who Black people are. Because if you do, if you walked on Hampton's campus or Howard's campus or Morehouse or Spelman or Fisk, you would have a much better appreciation for the diaspora, for the diversity, for the beauty in the diversity of who we are as Black people. So I'm not going to spend my time trying to educate people about who Black people are.
That was Senator Kamala Harris speaking on Breakfast Club, the radio show. Shireen Mitchell, your response.
Yeah, I mean, she's absolutely right. And one thing's for sure, I'm also a graduate of a HBCU. And once you have that experience, you would never question what Black identity is. The only people who make those, who question us like that are those who are from outside our community. And the other parts of that is within our community, we do have people coming from different walks of life, but that's the same of any other community. There is nothing different about our community than others, but somehow it's being used as a weapon. It's being used as a way to discredit us. It's a use case in Black identity being used as a weapon for not only to polarize the Black vote, but also to try to get other people to quote unquote hate, I hate to use hate, but to make it look like we are the ones who are the threats versus the threats that are upon us. So the ignorance of what's actually happening to us and how we're being targeted, how the example of what Donald Jr. did is an example of hate. the example of what Trump did to those boys in Central Park. For when they see us was the documentary about that. Those are prime examples of ways in which we are not only questioned about who we are, but questioned about our loyalty to this country. And we were born here, so there's no question about that.
And Shireen Mitchell, President Trump has also ridiculed and Senator Elizabeth Warren and accused her of not being truly Native American. Now his son, Junior, raises questions about Kamala Harris. The whole issue of online attacks on women and your organization, Stop Online Violence Against Women. Could you talk about that and the impact that is having on the national discourse?
Yes, I mean, again, we have a second report that's coming out, but our first report revealed that the Russian interference that was in the Mueller report that has been documented by 17 agencies was literally an intense and focused target on Black identity used as a weapon for voter suppression. And that example is what we're seeing right now. And you have to understand that even with the Elizabeth Warren aspect, that was a target to sow discord within the Native American community. So if you look at this pattern, there is a targeted pattern of going after brown and Black voters to interfere in the ways in which they decide to choose who they want to vote for. And that in itself is one of the focus problems that we need to be paying attention to. Our work showed that Black women were being targeted as early as 2013. This was well before everyone understood what was happening in 2016. And yet we still are having this conversation as if this is new. This is not new. It's been going on for years. What we're learning is there's a different way that we need to approach digital voter suppression, and we need to pay attention to what's happening to women of color because they are the targets. Black women are trusted voters in our community, and if we are not paying attention to what's happening to them or how they're being targeted, we will have a problem going into 2020.
Shireen Mitchell, we want to thank you for being with us, founder of the group Stop Online Violence Against Women, joining us from Washington, D.C. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at Senator Kamala Harris's record as a San Francisco DA and then California Attorney General. Stay with us. I Wonder by Brittany Howard and Ruby Amanfu. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as Senator Kamala Harris rises in the early presidential polls, she's facing increased scrutiny over her record as a prosecutor in California. In 2004, Harris became district attorney of San Francisco. She held the post until 2011, whereupon she became the attorney general of California. We're joined now by Lara Bazelon, a professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law. In January, she wrote a widely read article in the New York Times titled, "Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor." Bazelon wrote, quote, "Time after time when progressives urged her to embrace criminal justice reforms as a district attorney and then the state's attorney general, Ms. Harris opposed them or stayed silent. Most troubling, Ms. Harris fought tooth and nail to uphold wrongful convictions that had been secured through official misconduct that included evidence tampering, false testimony, and the suppression of crucial information by prosecutors.
Laura Bazelon joins us now from San Francisco. Thank you for joining us, Professor Bazelon. Can you start off by going through Senator Harris's record, starting with her being DA of San Francisco?
Sure. So she was elected in 2004, and she took a pretty courageous stance initially in that she didn't seek the death penalty against a man who had been accused of murdering a police officer, and she did get a lot of blowback from that. Subsequently, she moved much more towards the center in many of her positions, and two things happened in her tenure as DA that I think are worth mentioning. One is that there was a big crime lab scandal whereby there was a lab technician who was using the drugs rather than testing them, and as a result, many, many convictions became tainted, and it turned out that her office had known for months, top attorneys had, and had not disclosed that information to the defense. And when a judge found out, she became quite incensed and wrote an opinion castigating Harris for allowing this to happen. Harris's reaction to that was to try to get the judge disqualified by saying that she had a conflict of interest because her husband was a defense lawyer. That failed, and 600 cases were thrown out. The second piece of her tenure that I think is important that not a lot of people know about is a case involving a man named Jamal Truelove. That case was tried by Linda Allen, who was one of Harris's deputies. And the case against Truelove turned against a single eyewitness, turned on one eyewitness. It was a one eyewitness identification case. He was convicted and sentenced to 50 years to life. And the Court of Appeals threw out that conviction, castigating what Allen had done as gross and egregious prosecutorial misconduct. They said that her closing argument was a yarn made out of whole cloth. Recently, Truelove sued the city of California, the city of San Francisco, and won a $13.1 million judgment.
Now, you've also written about another case, George Gage. Could you talk about that as well?
Yes, and this is what prompted me really to write this piece. It's Harris's record on wrongful convictions. So after Truelove, there was Gage, and there was Johnny Baca, and Daniel Larson, and a man named Jose Luis Diaz. And in these cases, what happened was that Harris was at that point the AG, the top official in the state of California, the top prosecutor. And when these convictions came up, they had been handled by lower DAs, and it was her job to decide whether or not to defend them. In George Gage's case, he had been convicted, again, based on a single witness. It was his stepdaughter, Marion, who accused him of sexually abusing her, and the case turned on Marion's testimony. It turned out after the verdict that the prosecutor had suppressed a lot of material about Marion, including medical records and a note from her own mother saying, "My daughter is a pathological liar who lives her lies." And rather than acknowledge that this really terrible thing had happened, that this prosecutor had held back information that might have swayed the verdict, what Harris's attorneys went into court and did was say, look, George Gage, who had been forced to act as his own lawyer, didn't raise his claim in exactly the right way, and so for this technical reason, you should affirm that conviction. It went to oral argument, and the judges were very concerned about that position, told the deputy to go back and talk to his supervisors to try to resolve the case, which was a signal to really get rid of it and do the right thing. And instead, Harris's office doubled down, and George Gage is currently 80 years old. He is serving a effective death in prison sentence.
I want to go to an interview Kamala Harris did last month on Face the Nation with correspondent Ed O'Keefe.
You take your prosecutorial record against the push in your party for criminal justice reform. There's a lot of concern among, especially more liberal and younger parts of the party. You may not be the best person to do that, given that you were implementing those tough on crime initiatives as a prosecutor. Can they trust you to do that?
Well, here's the thing. When I became a prosecutor and when I was elected district attorney and also attorney general of California, I implemented some of the most significant reforms to date during those years that had been implemented. Like I said, I created one of the first reentry initiatives that became a model. It was designated as a model in the United States for what law enforcement should do to be, as I call it, smart on crime. I was the first in the nation leading the State Department of Justice in California, which, by the way, is the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, to require my agents to wear body cameras. I created, as Attorney General, the first in the nation implicit bias and procedural justice training for law enforcement, knowing that that had to be addressed, which is the implicit bias that exists in law enforcement and the potentially lethal outcomes that occur from that.
So the concerns are overblown?
The concerns are overblown, yes, no question.
So that is Senator Kamala Harris on Face the Nation, speaking to correspondent Ed O'Keefe. If you could respond to this, Laura Bazelon.
Sure. So you can hear her struggling to come up with a list. And she starts with her Back on Track program that she implemented as DA. This was a program that did help certain very select non-violent offenders re-enter society. It affected a very small group of people. She then talks about body-worn cameras. She was asked by the California state legislature to support a bill to mandate all police officers wearing body-worn cameras, and she declined to do that. With respect to implicit bias training, that is important. What's also important, and I would say more important, is investigating officer-involved shootings. She was called upon by the legislature to do that, and once again, she declined. And then when you go down the list of the issues that we think about when we think about a progressive prosecutor, on every single one of those issues, she was on the wrong side. And in some cases, her opponents ran to her left. So, for example, with marijuana legalization in her run for re-election as Attorney General, her opponent ran to legalize. She was against it. She's since changed her position now that the vast majority of the Democratic Party has moved in that direction. There are other examples as well. Her failure to support legislation that would reduce certain felonies to misdemeanors, going after parents criminally for having truant children. So there's a lengthy list of policy positions where there was the progressive path and there was the center-right path, and she did not take the progressive path.
I wanted to ask you specifically about this whole issue of parents with truant children and her policy of trying to prosecute them. I want to go to Kamala Harris's 2011 inaugural speech as California Attorney General as she touted her truancy policy during her tenure as District Attorney of San Francisco. This is what she said.
We know chronic truancy leads to dropping out, which dramatically increases the odds that a young person will either become a perpetrator or a victim of crime. Folks, it's time to get serious about the problem of chronic truancy in California. Last year alone, we had 600,000 truant students in our elementary schools, which roughly matches the number of inmates in our state prison system. And is it a coincidence? Of course not. And as unacceptable as this problem is, I know we can fix it. In San Francisco, we threatened the parents of truants with prosecution, and truancy dropped 32%. So we are putting parents on notice. If you fail to take responsibility for your kids, we are going to make sure that you face the full force and consequences of the law.
So that was Kamala Harris in 2011. What exactly did she do as DA in prosecuting parents?
So what ended up happening was that, and this actually took effect after she left and became Attorney General, prosecutors then had the power under this law to prosecute parents for a misdemeanor for being essentially responsible for their children missing numerous days of school. The idea being that they would be scared into making sure that their kids actually did attend school, and some parents were in fact prosecuted. And the pushback about this, I think, was on two fronts. One, it disproportionately impacted communities of color and parents of color who were basically more often targeted by this law than people who were white. And two, this idea that removing a parent from the home or subjecting them to criminal prosecution would be a tool to really sort of reknit a family, which I think is very questionable. There are a lot of things going on when there are truant children, including poverty, drug use, different issues with kids, and it's just not clear to many people who work in the juvenile space that the right answer to that is to criminalize the parent's conduct.
And has she responded since? I mean, that was a clip in 2011. Now that she is running for president and her record is being questioned on a number of these issues,
Well, I mean, that to me has been what's been frustrating, is that I don't find her responses to be responsive to the questions that she's being asked, and I don't feel oftentimes that she's being asked the hard question. So the Face the Nation clip is kind of the perfect example where she's thrown what I think is sort of a softball and then responds by ticking off a couple of accomplishments that when you look at them in the bigger context actually aren't that progressive. And so part of it is that she hasn't been pushed directly to answer for truancy, for George Gage, for Jamal Truelove, for marijuana, for opposing testing in Kevin Cooper's case. I mean, she's not getting those questions, I think, directly and forcefully enough. But then also, disappointingly, I think she hasn't reckoned with it and said, look, I am responsible for those decisions. She has said more broadly, the buck stops with me, I was the head of my office. But she needs to take that next step and acknowledge these specific things that she did and reckon with that record.
I want to go to Senator Kamala Harris speaking to reporters in January as she announced her candidacy for president. Senator Harris was asked about her role in defending the California Department of Corrections efforts to prevent transgender prisoners from getting gender reassignment surgery.
I was, as you are rightly pointing out, the Attorney General of California for 2 terms, and I had a host of clients that I was obligated to defend and represent, and I couldn't fire my clients. And there were, unfortunately, situations that occurred where my clients took positions that were contrary to my beliefs, and it was an office of a lot of people who would do the work on a daily basis. And do I wish that sometimes they would have personally consulted me before they wrote the things that they wrote? Yes, I do. But the bottom line is the buck stops with me, and I take full responsibility for what my office did. But on that issue, I will tell you, I vehemently disagree, and in fact worked behind the scenes to ensure that the Department of Corrections would allow transitioning inmates to receive the medical attention that they required, they needed, and deserved.
So that was Senator Harris. When she was announcing for president, she was speaking at Howard University. Professor Laura Bazelon, your response?
Well, I think what is important to do is to back up and talk about what the job of a prosecutor is. So many people think that it is about convicting people, and it is not. It's actually about doing justice, and that means that if you see something that is wrong, not just against your core principles, but violates, for example, the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause, you are required as the top prosecutor in your state to stand up and say, I won't enforce this law. And in fact, that's what she did in Proposition 8. So to say, I had these clients and I had no choice but to take these positions is not correct. So I'll give you this example. Proposition 8 was passed by California voters banning same-sex marriage. When she was basically told that she needed to defend this law, she refused to defend it because it violates the Equal Protection Law, in her opinion, and actually as the Supreme Court later decided. So she had that option when it came to this transgender surgery. She had that option when it came to the death penalty. When that came up and a judge found that it was unconstitutional, she defended it. And her response has always been, well, these are my clients. But in fact, no, your job is to uphold the Constitution. And if you think these laws violate the Constitution, then you should not defend them.
I wanted to ask you, in your op-ed piece, you say that the term progressive prosecutor has become a trendy subject these days. What do you see as what marks will be some of the hallmarks of a truly progressive prosecutor in America in 2019?
So you're right. It has become this real buzzword, and we just saw last week with this insurgent campaign of Tiffany Caban in Queens. This is someone who's 31, a queer Latina, lifelong public defender, never prosecuted a case, and she ran on a platform of dismantling our system of mass incarceration, decriminalizing certain crimes, not prosecuting certain crimes, ending cash money bail, which is essentially a criminalization of poverty because it says to people whether you can get out or not doesn't really depend on anything other than your ability to pay, which means a wealthy person can be free and a poor person has to stay and languish in jail while their case goes forward. So progressive prosecutors, they run on those platforms, and they also run, most importantly to me, on a platform of we are going to correct wrongful convictions. And when people are suffering and dying in prison and they are innocent or they are wrongfully convicted because of corrupt official misconduct, we are going to uncover that, we are going to go to court, and we are going to do the right thing and undo those convictions. So it's a laundry list of policy positions, and they are brave and they are new in our system because we've had for so many decades people running on who can be the toughest on crime. But a lot of Americans are getting really fed up with that because it's expensive, it's ineffective, and it's unjust and racist. And so these new prosecutors are embracing reform, and they are running and they are winning on that platform.
Laura Bazelon, we want to thank you for being with us, professor at University of San Francisco School of Law, director of the school's Criminal and Juvenile Justice and Racial Justice Law Clinics. We'll link to your piece in the New York Times. Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor. That does it for our show. Thursday, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Friday, we'll be joined by Noam Chomsky. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.